Hello everyone, it's Father Hayes and we are continuing our series of videos on the Mass, and we've been creating a context to work with before we go into the specific parts of the Liturgy of the Eucharist, taking those individual threads and themes and weaving them together into the tapestry that God is revealing to us in the Mass. So today we're going to talk about the Passover, and one of my primary sources for a lot of my material for this video and the following videos is this book by Drs. John Bergsma and Brad Pintry on the Old Testament. So it's not cheap, but it's a worthwhile investment. So I definitely encourage you to consider that. So when we're talking about the Passover, now we're probably fairly familiar with the Passover story, but there's some specific details that we want to hone in on. The first is really the context for the Passover is right before the Passover. Remember that Moses goes to Pharaoh. He tells Pharaoh to allow the Jewish people to leave. Pharaoh resists. And then we have the 10 plagues. Now the 10 plagues really can be seen in the context of it's a war on the gods of Egypt. And so the Passover is actually in the context of the 10th and final plague. All the different gods of Egypt, well, Pharaoh was considered one of the gods of Egypt. And so this final plague, where this destroying angel, the angel of death, goes and strikes down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, is an attack on Pharaoh. It's a repudiation of Pharaoh. And so that's the first context that we have, that it is within this context of the plagues of Egypt. So therefore, the Passover is the fundamental observance of the Israelite religion and then later on of Judaism. And the Passover, we would say, is the sacrifice that it was intended to commemorate a definitive historical event that established the identity of the people of Israel on the basis of God's singular saving act of deliverance. And that comes from this book here, which is an important thing for us to focus on because we also derive our identity from the true Passover, which is the Passover in the Mass. So the word Passover comes from the Hebrew word Passah, which means to pass over. And so it's a reference to the destroying angel passing over the houses that are marked on the lintel and the doorpost with the blood of the sacrificed lamb. Therefore, when the destroying angel saw those houses with the blood mark on the door, it would pass over. So that's where we get the word Passover from. Now, the other important detail about the Passover is that this is something that was commanded by God, right? And he was given instructions on how to proceed with this sacrifice. And it is a ritual sacrifice, which is an important detail. All the liturgical sacrifices that we see in the Old Testament are ritual sacrifices, right? Meaning they have a specific purpose and they have specific parts. And all of these sacrifices are coming directly from God's instruction. In other words, God is teaching us how to worship. So in the Passover, it consists of several steps and instructions. Each family was to procure a lamb, and that lamb would be killed. Now, it had to be an unblemished male lamb, 1 year old, and that lamb would be killed, be sacrificed. The lamb, not a bone of the lamb is to be broken. So in that sacrificing, no bones broken. It has to be sacrificed whole. Then they would dip a branch from a hyssop branch in the blood of the lamb, and they would use that to sprinkle the blood of the lamb on the doorpost and the lintel of the home. So if you think about it, with a lintel is that crossbeam at the top of the door, and then you have the doorpost. So you have the vertical and the horizontal. Well, where else do we see the lamb sacrificed on wood and the blood of the lamb on the wood that is vertical and horizontal? But obviously this is a prefiguring of the cross. Then the flesh of the lamb had to be roasted and eaten with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. So there was a meal element to this sacrifice, this sacred ritual. And then you have the original Passover, which is a historical event, but then every year following, that ritual would be observed in remembrance of the original Passover. And to remember is not simply to think of something that happened only in the past, but in this context, it's talking about to make it present to them in the present moment. The other thing that's an important detail is that the original Passover, the one in Egypt, was a domestic sacrifice. It was the head of the household, the father of the household, who would act as priest. And remember, this directs us back to what we call the primordial priesthood, right? The Levitical priesthood of the Old Testament that we're familiar with and that occurred during the time of Jesus. That was the result of the Israelites falling into apostasy with the golden calf. So the original Passover takes place before that event. So the priesthood that's involved is that original primordial priesthood. So when we see this fulfilled with Christ, we'll see him going back to the original priesthood. So as I said earlier, the Passover sacrifice is completed with a sacred meal in which the flesh of the lamb must be eaten. So you can't just do the sacrifice and sprinkle the blood and then that's it. It had to include the eating of the flesh of the lamb. So that's what completed the Passover sacrifice. It wasn't the death of the lamb, it was the consuming of its flesh. So therefore, we can see the Passover, particularly the original Passover event, is both a sacrifice, a ritual sacrifice, and a sacred meal. And then, as we also said, the Passover is then to be celebrated annually in conjunction with the 7-day feast of unleavened bread. So in this way, that original deliverance event of Passover is not simply a one-time event, but is something that's continually made present to the people. This idea of remembering, making present. So a couple of points to just wrap up on. As we said, the Passover sacrifice and meal, this is something that comes directly from God. Right? God gives the instructions both in Exodus, but then also in the book of Numbers on how to perform the Passover sacrifice, how to perform the Passover ritual. And that's an important thing for us to meditate on because the Mass comes from God. It's not something that we as humans come up with on our own. But it also is pointing us to a heavenly reality, that the Mass is giving us access to the worship of heaven. And so that's an important thing for us to also be anchoring ourselves in. So these are some of the important themes and details that we see in the Passover sacrifice. So in our next video, we'll talk about how we see this fulfilled in Christ, how this original Passover is actually prefiguring and pointing to the Paschal mystery of Christ, and how we participate in that Paschal mystery in the Mass. May God be with you.